The letter was sitting on my desk when I came back from lunch. A white FedEx envelope, my name typed on the label in Helvetica, no return address. I stood in the doorway of my office for a moment, briefcase still in hand, the smell of the delicacy sandwich I'd just eaten still on my breath. Something about it felt wrong before I even touched it. I'd been at Vantex Medical for 14 years. I knew every person in that building by name, knew their spouses' names, knew which ones took their coffee black, and which ones were secretly allergic to the hand soap in the third-floor break room. The FedEx envelope didn't fit. Nobody sent internal documents that way. Inside was a single sheet of paper, letterhead from Aldrich Finn's office, my name, a date, the words position elimination, and effective immediately. And please surrender your badge to security upon reading this notice. There was a paragraph about a severance review pending HR processing, which was corporate shorthand for, we haven't decided yet whether we're giving you anything. 14 years. I read it twice standing up, because my legs wouldn't let me sit down. 14 years of 12-hour days and product launches and 3 a.m. calls from the clean room when the assembly line went down, and Aldrich Finn had communicated all of it was over through overnight mail. He could have called me. He could have knocked on my door, which was 37 steps from his. He chose FedEx. He chose Helvetica. After 14 years, that's what I was worth to him. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which should tell you something about the kind of person I am. My father worked the blast furnaces at U.S. Steel for 31 years. He came home every night smelling like metal and heat, and he never complained about it in front of us kids. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he was from a generation that kept those things internal. My mother worked a lunch counter at a Woolworth's until I was 12, then cleaned office buildings downtown after the store closed. We weren't poor in the way that shows up in movies, but we were the kind of family where the car repair went on a payment plan and Christmas presents came from layaway. What I had was a knack for how things fit together. Not academically, I wasn't that kid. I was the one taking apart the toaster and putting it back together on the kitchen table, while my dad watched with equal parts suspicion and quiet pride. I got a 2-year degree from Ivy Tech, worked a factory floor in Hammond for 6 years, then found my way into medical device manufacturing through a job listing that paid 15 cents an hour more than what I was making. That was the entire extent of my career strategy at 29. By the time I was 37, I was Vantex Medical's lead process engineer. Not because I'd networked my way there or played golf with the right people. Because the products I designed worked, I understood materials and tolerances, and the particular challenge of building something that has to be sterile under pressure, literally and figuratively, and still function flawlessly when a surgeon needs it at 2 in the morning. Vantex's entire surgical instrument packaging line, the line that accounted for the majority of their revenue, was built on processes I had developed from scratch. I didn't write the business plan. I didn't present to investors. I was in the manufacturing bay, running trial cycles, while the executives were upstairs giving PowerPoint presentations about disrupting the sterile packaging market. But I was the one who figured out how to actually do it. Aldrich Finn arrived 2 years before the letter. He came in from a private equity firm in Connecticut, brought in by the board to optimize operations and position the company for growth, which is a phrase that, in my experience, means layoffs and a sale. He was 54 years old, had never worked in manufacturing a single day in his life, and carried the particular confidence of someone who had never been wrong in a way that cost him personally. He drove a Tesla with Connecticut plates, wore shirts without ties even when he should have, and said at the end of the day, so many times in a single meeting that I once counted 11. His idea of understanding the product line was a 45-minute facility tour, after which he declared that certain processes seemed redundant. My wife Patrice met him once at a company holiday party. On the drive home, she said simply, "That man doesn't know what he doesn't know." She was right, as she tends to be. She teaches 9th grade biology at the high school, 3 miles from our house, and has a gift for reading people that I've never been able to replicate. The financial pressure in our house was real. We had a $295,000 mortgage remaining on our place in Naperville, the one we'd bought when our son Brody was in 2nd grade, and we thought we'd be there forever. Brody was 16 now, already 6'1", already getting quiet looks from basketball coaches at programs I'd told him were within reach if he kept working. The house needed a new roof. Patrice's mother's assisted living facility in Peoria had raised its monthly rate again. I'd been managing it all month by month, the way people do when they're earning a good salary but not a wealthy one, where the spreadsheet works as long as nothing unexpected happens. Unexpected happened on a Wednesday in October when I came back from a turkey club at the deli around the corner. I didn't cry driving home. I was too stunned for that. I drove on autopilot up I-355, the tollway, the flat landscape of the western suburbs unreeling past me in the gray afternoon light. The radio was on a talk station, and I turned it off because the voices were too loud for my head. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had managed to get myself to something that felt like calm, but was probably closer to shock. Patrice's car was in the garage. She'd had a half day. I sat at the kitchen table and put the FedEx letter flat on the surface and waited for her to come downstairs. She read it once. Then she looked at me with her teacher eyes, the ones that have seen teenagers try to bluff their way through situations they don't understand, and she said, "There's something off about this. The timing." She meant Solara Health Systems. The acquisition rumors had been circulating for 4 months. Solara was a $2 billion medical technology company out of Minneapolis, publicly interested in Vantex, specifically for its surgical instrument packaging line. The deal being discussed was somewhere around $480 million. People in the break room were already doing the math on what an acquisition bonus might look like. Aldrich had let me go a week before Solara's due diligence team was scheduled to arrive on site. I didn't understand why yet. I told Patrice I didn't understand why, and she put on a pot of coffee, which is what she does when something requires thinking through, and said we were going to figure it out. What happened next was genuinely accidental. The following Saturday, I was reorganizing the garage. I'd been meaning to do it for 8 months, and with nowhere to be on Monday morning for the first time in 14 years, I had the time and the restless energy of someone who needs physical motion to keep from sitting inside his own thoughts. A storage box labeled Work Docs 2015-2019 slipped from my grip and hit the concrete floor. Papers went everywhere. Tax documents, old performance reviews, product spec sheets I'd never thrown away, and at the bottom of the pile, a manila envelope with my own handwriting on the front. Patent. Keep. I stood there in the garage holding that envelope, October cold, coming in through the open door, and felt something shift in my chest like a gear catching. In 2017, I had designed what I called a micro-pressure equalization valve. A small but critical innovation in the sealing mechanism for sterile surgical instrument packaging. The problem it solved was real. Standard sealed packaging sometimes experienced micro-failures during transportation and altitude changes, compromising sterility in ways that weren't always visually detectable. My valve equalized internal pressure automatically, eliminating that failure mode entirely. It was elegant, and it worked, and I was proud of it in the specific, quiet way of a person who has solved a real problem rather than a theoretical one. An engineer named Emil Strand, who consulted part-time for Vantex before retiring fully, had seen the valve and told me with the directness I still appreciate that what I had was not just a process improvement but a patentable invention. He'd been an engineer at Motorola for 28 years and had filed 9 patents of his own. He knew the difference. "Calvin," he'd said, standing in the doorway of my workspace holding the prototype, "this is yours, not Vantex's, yours. Your employment contract covers process development within your defined role. This goes beyond that scope. File the paperwork, today." I'd hesitated. It felt complicated. It felt like friction. Emil had looked at me with the patience of a man who has watched other people make this mistake before and said, "Friction now or catastrophe later. Your choice." Patrice and I spent $21,000, our emergency fund, plus a small loan from her credit union, to retain a patent attorney in Chicago named Renee Park, who specialized in manufacturing and medical device intellectual property. It felt extravagant. It felt slightly crazy. Patrice had held my hand at the kitchen table and said, "Emil knows what he's talking about. We trust Emil." The patent was approved in 2018. U.S. patent number 10,842,073. Pressure equals sterile packaging system for surgical instruments. Filed under my name, Calvin Reed, sole inventor. Sitting on the garage floor with the manila envelope, I pulled out the USPTO confirmation and the approval letter. Then I went inside, opened my laptop, and pulled up the patent database. Still valid. 17 years remaining. I cross-referenced it with Vantex's investor relations page and their most recent SEC filings. My valve was in every sterile packaging product Vantex made. It had been incorporated into the product line in 2019 and had become, based on their own regulatory documents, the core differentiating feature that drove a 340% revenue increase in the surgical packaging segment over the following 3 years. Solara Health Systems, in their publicly available letter of intent, had specifically cited Vantex's proprietary sterile packaging technology as the primary asset driving their acquisition interest. The proprietary sterile packaging technology was my patent. I looked at that for a long time. Then I called Renee Park. She picked up on the second ring. It was a Saturday afternoon. She said, "Calvin Reed, I wondered when I'd hear from you." "You knew this would happen?" "I knew something like it was possible. That's why I called you twice last year, to check whether you'd reviewed your patent against Vantex's product filings." "You didn't call back." "I'd been too busy keeping their operations running to pay attention to my own interests." There's a lesson in that I've told other people many times since. Renee and I met in her office on Michigan Avenue the following Monday. She'd already done the preliminary analysis over the weekend. She laid 4 documents across her conference table: my patent, Vantex's most recent 10K filing, Solara's letter of intent, and an FDA submission Vantex had made 2 years prior explicitly crediting their pressure equalization system as proprietary. "Vantex has been using your patented technology since 2019 without a licensing agreement," she said, in the same level tone she might use to note that it was raining. "They've been generating revenue from it, marketing it as their own, and they are now in the process of selling it to Solara for $480 million. Their 2023 annual report indicates the sterile packaging segment accounts for 79% of total company revenue." 79%. I didn't laugh. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt sitting across from Renee 24 floors above Michigan Avenue was something very quiet and very cold. 14 years, the FedEx letter, the Helvetica font. "What happens when Solara's IP team finds this during due diligence?" I asked. Renee folded her hands. "Their legal team will discover that the core asset they're paying $480 million for is not owned by the company they're acquiring. At that point, no board would approve the transaction." I called Emil that evening from the back porch, watching Brody shoot free throws in the driveway. He answered after 4 rings, sounding like a man who'd been asleep in an armchair. "I've been expecting this call for 2 years, he said, once I explained. "What should I do?" "Let Solara's team do their job," he said. "Some lessons teach better when they're discovered than when they're explained." The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I started running in the mornings again, something I hadn't done in 3 years. I took Brody to his away game in Joliet on a Tuesday night and stood in those echoing bleachers and cheered when he hit a pull-up jumper in the 4th quarter. And I didn't think about Vantex even once. I slept 8 hours a night. My blood pressure, which my doctor had been quietly alarmed about for 2 years, dropped to levels he called dramatically improved. "Whatever you're doing differently," he said at my follow-up, "keep doing it." Renee called on a Thursday afternoon. Solara's IP audit team had flagged my patent. Based on standard timelines, Aldrich would know by end of week. He called on a Friday, 4:48 in the afternoon. I was cutting vegetables for dinner when my phone showed his name. Calvin. His voice had the texture of a man who'd been awake for 36 hours and knew exactly why. "We need to resolve a legal matter." "Hello, Aldrich. There's a patent that's come up in the Solara review. Number 10,842,773. I need to understand your position on this." I set down the knife. "My position is that I'm the sole inventor of record on that patent, and have been since 2018. Was there something specific you needed to understand?" "Look, we can make this work for everyone. There are employees depending on this acquisition, Calvin. Families. People who've worked alongside you for years." I thought about the FedEx envelope, the Helvetica font, 37 steps. "I'm sure those employees are important to you," I said. "Name a number. Whatever's reasonable. We can backdate a licensing arrangement, document it as a legacy agreement." Aldrich, backdating a licensing agreement to misrepresent IP ownership during a corporate acquisition is securities fraud. I'd encourage you to have your attorneys explain that clearly, since apparently it needs explaining. The silence that followed was complete. "I built your product line," I said. "I built the thing Solara is paying $480 million for. You sent me a FedEx letter. We're done talking." He showed up at our house on Sunday morning. His Tesla was in the driveway. Silver Connecticut plates, conspicuous in our neighborhood of Fords and Chevys. I watched him from the upstairs window for a moment, then went downstairs. He was on the front porch in jeans, and a fleece he'd probably bought at an airport, looking like a man who had finally been introduced to the consequences of his own decisions, and found the introduction deeply unwelcome. The private equity swagger was entirely gone. "Calvin," he said, "thank you for coming to the door." It's my house, Aldrich. Right. Yes. He rubbed the back of his neck. I made mistakes. How I handled your departure was wrong. You deserved better. I was under pressure from the board about the acquisition timeline, and I made a decision I shouldn't have made. You made a lot of decisions you shouldn't have made. The timeline pressure was one afternoon. The 14 years was 14 years. He was quiet for a moment, then softer. What do you want from me? I looked at him on my porch. This man who had walked into a company built on other people's expertise and treated it like a spreadsheet entry. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of clarity. He wasn't asking me to help the company. He was asking me to save him. Those were different things. I'm going to license my patent through proper legal channels at fair market rates, I said. If Vantex wants to continue using my technology, they can apply for a license like anyone else. You're welcome to share that with your board. I went back inside. Patrice had been listening from the hallway. She didn't say anything. She handed me a cup of coffee and squeezed my arm. Solara formally suspended due diligence 11 days later. The press release said the parties had mutually agreed that conditions for a successful transaction could not be met. The Chicago Tribune's business desk was less gentle. Vantex Medical's 480M Solara deal collapses amid patent dispute. Vantex's valuation dropped 38% in the following week. The board convened an emergency session. Aldrich Fenn submitted his resignation the following Tuesday to pursue new opportunities, as the statement said, which is what statements always say when the real story is too embarrassing to print. The new interim CEO was a woman named Constance Yi, who had been VP of Operations for 6 years. She was one of the clearest thinkers I'd encountered at Vantex, and she called me within 48 hours of taking the role. Calvin, she said, I want to start by saying that what happened to you was wrong, and I intend to put that in writing as well. I appreciate that, Constance. I've reviewed your employment contract and the full patent history. I want to discuss licensing terms, but I also want to address the 5 years of unauthorized use honestly, because that's a liability the company needs to own. Renee and Constance's legal team negotiated for 3 weeks. The final agreement, a non-exclusive license for $78 million, plus $17 million in back pay for unauthorized use between 2019 and 2023. $95 million total. I remember sitting at our kitchen table when Renee called with the final number. Patrice was across from me, grading papers, reading glasses on, red pen in hand. She looked up when she heard my voice change. I wrote the number on the back of one of her students' quiz papers and slid it across the table. She stared at it, set down the pen. Then she laughed, a real laugh, the full one that goes with her eyes, and said, Emil Strand is getting the nicest bottle of scotch I can find. We paid off the mortgage on a Tuesday morning. It takes about 4 minutes, and then you're sitting there looking at a zero balance on a screen, waiting to feel something proportionate to the moment. I called my mother and Gary afterward. She didn't say much. I could hear her breathing, and then she said, your father would have been proud, and we both needed a minute after that. The roof got replaced. The assisted living bill in Peoria stopped being something Patrice and I discussed at midnight. Brody's college fund went from an aspiration to a certainty. I wasn't done. Emil and I had been circling the same idea for weeks. There were engineers like me everywhere, skilled people, building things that other people would eventually monetize, who had no idea that the inventions they created at 3 a.m. might not automatically belong to their employers, who had never had someone like Emil standing in the doorway, telling them to file the paperwork. We opened a consulting practice together in a renovated space 2 blocks from the Naperville train station. We called it Strand Reed Engineering Advisors. Our focus was specific, helping working engineers, machinists, and technical professionals understand their intellectual property rights before the moment of crisis, not after. Our first client came 3 weeks after we opened, a tooling engineer from Rockford named Damien, 28 years old, who had developed a novel die casting process his employer had quietly incorporated into production without acknowledgement or compensation. He sat across from Emil and me at our conference table looking exactly the way I'd looked in Renee's office on Michigan Avenue, stunned, uncertain, not quite believing what he was hearing. You may have options, I told him, but the first thing we're going to do is look at every piece of documentation you have. Every email, every design file, every notebook entry. From here, it's all about what you can prove. He nodded. He reminded me of myself at that age, which is a feeling I've gotten used to. I coach Brody's AAU team on Saturday mornings now. I have not missed a single game this season, not one, and there have been 17 of them. Patrice comes to the home games and drinks bad gymnasium coffee and cheers louder than any other parent in the stands, and I love her completely for it. Last month, Brody asked me over dinner what the whole Vantex situation had actually taught me. 3 things, I said. Read your employment contract before you sign it, specifically the IP assignment clause. Document everything you build, and make sure you understand who owns it. And third, he waited. The people who actually make things have more power than they realize. But only if they're paying attention. He turned that over, with the particular seriousness of a 16-year-old deciding whether adult wisdom is worth storing. What if you hadn't found that envelope in the garage? He asked. I thought about the box slipping from the shelf, paper scattering across the concrete, the cold air coming through the open door, about Emil standing in my workspace 7 years ago, holding that prototype valve, telling me the friction was worth it. Then this would be a different story, I said, and probably not one worth telling. The patent runs until 2038. By then, Brody will be 30. Whatever he's building by that point, wherever he's building it, he'll know to protect it. That's the only inheritance that doesn't depreciate.